Welcome to the MS Education podcast series. Thank you for joining me. I'm Andrea Salmon, and in each episode we are going to be joined by an expert to discuss strategies for living well with multiple sclerosis.
Hi, my name's Jodi Haartsen. I'm the Executive Manager of Client Engagement and Wellbeing at MSL, and I'm very grateful to Associate Professor Anneke Walt today, who's giving us her time to talk about this really important topic of vaccinations, COVID vaccinations for people with MS. So thank you, Anneke. Anneke is a neurologist at Alfred Health in Melbourne, where she's the director of their MS Neuroimmunology and Neuro-Ophthalmology service there. She leads the MS and Neuro-Ophthalmology Research Group through Monash University. She completed her undergraduate training in South Africa before relocating to Australia, where she completed specialist training in neurology and a PhD in neuroscience at the Uni of Melbourne. Her research interests include monitoring MS tremor, monitoring cerebellar dysfunction and MS cognition. She's a keen interest in women's health in MS as well as symptom management for people with MS. But she's also been doing a lot of work on managing people with MS during COVID and also looking at and helping us understand better the vaccinations and what they're going to mean for people with MS. So, Anneke, can you tell us a little bit about, firstly, welcome, and can you tell us a little bit about the vaccinations that are available and the COVID-19 vaccinations, and importantly, are they safe for people with MS?
Thanks, Jodi, and thanks for inviting me to talk about this. So it's clearly very topical, and I'm glad that we're having this conversation at this stage of the vaccine rollout in Australia, where it's still in planning. So yes, I think that the first thing to know is that you get different types of vaccines. So we can roughly group vaccines into live vaccines, which is where vaccines are developed from actual viruses that are just weakened a little bit. And these are the type of vaccines that we generally would consider to be contraindicated in people with MS. So these, especially if you're on a disease-modifying treatment. So these are vaccines like the chickenpox vaccine, for instance, the yellow fever vaccine, the measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine. But what the situation that we're in with the COVID vaccines is that they are all inactivated or non-live vaccines, which is already really good news for people with MS, because it means that it can be safely given to everyone with MS, whether they are on a disease-modifying treatment or not. So there's several vaccines that have already made it to distribution and to market as such, I guess. And in Australia, the government has secured access to 3 vaccines. So I'll briefly tell you about these 3 options that we will probably have, and we don't know how that's going to work. But basically, these vaccines, the first vaccine, and I think the one that's probably been in the news the most, is the first one that made it through the FDA in the US, which is the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine. So this is actually a mRNA vaccine, or a messenger RNA vaccine, which is a completely new way of developing vaccines, and it's really exciting. So this technology has been in development for a long time, and the laboratory science is really decade old already. But how this works is basically RNA is part of your genetic code, really. So what the vaccine does, it's a little nanoparticle, which means it's tiny, 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 and it can actually go into the cell in the body, and it gives the cell this piece of code, which is the mRNA, the messenger RNA, which the cell can then look at and use its own mechanisms to decode, and it makes a piece of protein that is a little protein, or the spike protein of this COVID virus, that can then be shown on the surface of the cell. The immune system recognizes that, and it's a very natural way to use the body's natural mechanisms to really present that to the immune system. And that's probably why it's so effective. So we know that in the trials, it appears to protect people with about a 95% efficacy against contracting the infection. So So that's the one vaccine. And the other one that's similar to that is the Moderna vaccine, I guess that's probably how you pronounce it, which has also been rolled out in the US, but I don't think that one is going to be, at this stage, doesn't look like the Australian government has secured any of those ones. The second one, which has also been in the news quite a bit, is the AstraZeneca Oxford vaccine. And some of that vaccine is actually being produced, I think, in a facility in Melbourne. So the Australian government has certainly secured a big load of that. And that's what we call a viral vector vaccine. So this is a vaccine where a piece of the virus, the coronavirus, is actually latched onto another type of virus. In this case, it's actually a virus that causes a cold in chimpanzees. So you want to combine it with a virus that's not common in humans. Otherwise, your body won't recognize it and won't make an immune response. And this is basically put together, the genetic code of this whole combination is changed. So the virus can't actually replicate in any way, either of the two. And that actually is then put into your system. Your immune system recognizes that as a foreign and starts triggering antibodies to that. So that vaccine is, again, going to be available, and it's reported to be about 70% effective at preventing infection, but it's 100% effective in preventing severe infection, which I think is something that hasn't actually been highlighted, and is really important. That everybody who has that vaccine, no one has had any severe illness, which is really important, if we think about what we are actually trying to achieve with the vaccines. The last vaccine is made by a company called Novavax, and this is a protein vaccine. And these proteins are, protein antigens or aggregates of protein clusters. Again, the spike protein of the coronavirus, which has been sort of, again, modified, and that is sort of put into, a vaccine that can then be injected into the body. And it holds great promise. Like, certainly it looks like the side effect profile of this Novavax vaccine seems to be quite mild. It's a vaccine that we're very familiar with. So a similar type of vaccine would, for instance, be the Gardasil vaccine that's used for against cervical cancer and the human papillomavirus that everybody gets at school age. So it's a technology that's very familiar, and we can anticipate how that's going to work. So I think, that's one that I think is not going to be immediately available, but hopefully soon after that. Sorry, that was a long answer.
That was great. Thank you. It's really, it's great to understand those vaccinations early. So, I guess one of the questions is, if people, if these vaccinations, if people have these vaccinations, once a person's had a vaccination, do you think that that people will still need to wear masks and socially distance, and what will that mean after people? What has it meant for people, for other countries who they're already using vaccinations?
Yeah, I think that is one of the things that we don't know about these vaccines. So I think that what we do know is that these vaccines are safe. So, if we look at these trials, for instance, I think it was the Pfizer one, there's almost more than 36,000 people who were in the trials of these drugs. So we know what the immediate side effects are, what are the risks. But what we don't know is how long are these vaccines going to last for? And also the second question, especially in the context of new variations of the COVID virus that's seen in the UK and also in South Africa, is it possible that people will, can still actually catch the virus and have it, be asymptomatic from it despite being vaccinated? So what that would mean is that you might not get unwell from it, but the virus could be in your body, and you might be able to transmit that virus to other people, and they could get unwell if they haven't been vaccinated. So it's quite likely that even when the vaccinations are being rolled out, that social distancing and wearing a mask in certain situations and in hot zones and so forth is going to stay part of our lives for quite some time going forward, and that we're going to have to be very aware of this. We are in a very good position, of course, in Australia, in that, by the time that we start our vaccination programs, tens of thousands of people in the UK and Europe and the US would already have had these vaccines. and that we will be able to start getting more information about how the virus is the virus still shedding once you've had the vaccine, and what exactly happens. We'll get some information on that, hopefully not too far in the future.
Mm-hmm. And that information about the vaccinations and people with MS, are they capturing that information in the other countries where they treat people with MS and are giving the vaccinations? And how is that sort of information being shared?
Well, I think, the same. I guess the first thing is to say that, yes, there's ongoing data collection. So you can imagine in the US and also in the UK, I know for sure that people are collecting information about vaccinating people with MS on various disease-modifying drugs. And I think we're going to have much more, much more proper data as to exactly what happens. Do they see any different side effects? Is there any unexpected problems? And then also, how effective is the vaccine in people with MS who are on disease-modifying treatment? So all of that data collection is happening. And I suspect that as it was when the pandemic first started, a lot of that information will be shared very rapidly through the MS scientific community, because it's so critical for us to know this, and for us to provide better information to the people that we look after. So, of course, these things will be published, and the value of that is that, of course, once something is published in a scientific journal, we can be sure that it's been scrutinized by experts in the field multiple times before it goes out to publication. But initial results will probably be shared much more informally.
I think that was one of the great things that we really saw in the pandemic, how the MS community just really gathered together and really gave information that was really quick and were able to really inform decisions moving forward, which was just fantastic. And it's really reassuring to know that that's happening again with the vaccination. So we've got that that in Australia we are in the position of being able to learn from others, and those learnings are shared really quickly, which is great. One of the big questions, of course, is for people who are on MS treatments, the MS treatments change their immune system. And one of the questions is, will their treatments need to change? And what will they still be able to have the vaccinations?
Yeah, so I guess that is a really important question. And there's a lot of information that, again, hopefully we'll be able to answer that question with much more specific data relating to the COVID vaccine. I guess the first thing to say is, again, that whatever disease-modifying treatment you are on, you are safe to have the vaccine. And if the vaccine is offered to you, then take it. That we don't know exactly what this program is going to look like, but from just the big bullet points that we've seen so far, it looks like younger adults with a comorbidity or with another medical condition will be in the Group 1B rollout of the vaccination program in Australia. So this is set to start in February, but we don't have any details yet. So I think that, once we know the details, for instance, with the Pfizer vaccine, so that's the mRNA vaccine, that vaccine has to be stored at -80 degrees. So it's very hard to distribute. So it's quite likely that there's going to be specific vaccination hubs for that people may have to make a booking. We don't know exactly what it's going to look like. And that people might be given a date and said, well, this is the day that you're having your vaccine, or, we don't know what it's going to look like. But I think that in broad terms, I would say to anybody with MS, whatever treatment you're on, to have the vaccine when it's offered to you. Once we know a bit more detail, we can discuss, if you have your vaccine next week and your infusion is due next week, of course, there's flexibility around these things. But as a general rule, there shouldn't be any delays in your treatment. And I think this question often comes up, Jodi, with people on the ocrelizumab infusions or Ocrevus. And this is because those drugs in particular deplete a cell called that are anti-CD20 positive. So what that means is that you basically deplete a certain immune cell called a B cell, and B cells are involved as they mature in antibody production, and you really do need some antibody production or to stimulate antibody production to mount a response to a vaccine. So what do we know about people on ocrelizumab who have been vaccinated? Do we know anything about that in relation to other vaccines? And the answer is, well, not that much, but there is some information, and all of it's quite reassuring. I guess the first thing to say is that when people have Ocrevus or rituximab is the other one, you still have the same memory to your immune system remembers all of the infections you've had in the past, the vaccinations you've had throughout your life. That doesn't change. So you remain immune to that. The second thing is to say that in studies that's been done in people on ocrelizumab, where they looked at how people respond to the flu vaccine, to the tetanus vaccine, and also to the pneumococcal vaccine, if you look at before and after and when the vaccine was given in relation to their infusion, what we can see is that people on ocrelizumab have a slightly blunted effect to the vaccine. So, for instance, if we look at if I just think about the information, if you look at the pneumococcal vaccine, so that's the vaccine that you can have to protect you against a certain type of pneumonia. People off ocrelizumab that are not exposed to ocrelizumab, they would mount an immune response to that vaccine 75 to 90% of the times. Whereas people on ocrelizumab, and this was 4 weeks after their infusion, they had an immune response to the vaccine between 50 and 80% of the times. So, and that is actually, so it's less, but it's still enough for you to be considered having an effective response to the vaccine. So there's no reason to think that that's not also going to be the case with the COVID-19 vaccines. Because I think the other interesting thing about these COVID vaccines is that they are far more effective than, for instance, the flu vaccine, which in general will give you, on average, if you have a flu vaccine, you have about a 40 to 60% protection against flu. So these vaccines are already even, they're all more effective than that. And then, so even if you do have a bit of a blunted response because of the treatment that you're on, you should still be able to mount enough of an immune response that you will be protected. So, so I don't think that we need to overly complicate this. I guess if you are going to be due to have your second cycle of cladribine or alemtuzumab, then that is something to discuss because that depletes your immune system for a good 4 weeks. So they might be, it might be good to just wait a month or so after your treatment before you have the vaccine.
I'm sure that it's all sounding really reassuring so far, and I'm sure that we'll have more information available by the time we do have rollout, because information is becoming so quickly. But it's really reassuring that that the information that we can learn from other vaccines because they've acted in such a similar way. We know that the Australian neurologists did a great job in producing guidelines to help guide neurologists who may not specialise in MS through COVID pandemic about treatments. And do you think it's likely that that the Australian neurologists will also, again, in this case, provide some guidance around the timing for people who don't have access as much to MS clinics and MS specialist neurologists?
Yes, I think that is actually something that's underway at the moment. So there is a coordinated effort for the MS neurologists to all look at the published data and to continue to evaluate any information that we are receiving where people with MS have been vaccinated. So I'm sure that a document and some more detailed information and suggestions will be forthcoming soon.
Yeah, that's terrific. That's great news. And what about the side effects of the vaccinations? And the question around will the vaccinations? Lots of people have a fear that it's going to make their MS worse or trigger a relapse. So do we know about that at all?
Yeah, I think that. Yeah, That's, of course, it is really important to think about that. But I think, we do know that I know people think of this as a new vaccine, but the actual way that we make vaccines and vaccine technology is the same really for all vaccines. The mRNA vaccines are new. That's a new way to do things. But there are other drugs that are produced in that way. So we do have some idea of what to expect, and the side effects are not going to be that different than it would be for other vaccines, really. I guess the main thing to, as with any drug, is that there's always a risk of a severe allergic reaction, but these are extremely rare. However, if someone with MS has ever had an anaphylactic reaction, so, the type of allergic reaction where your body goes into complete shock and shuts down, then that is something to discuss before you have the vaccine. The second thing is that the most common reaction really seems to be a headache and a fever. And that's very common. So I think with people with MS, as we all know, some people with MS are very heat sensitive. So a fever that could last for 24 hours can, of course, make your MS symptoms a bit worse. But as the fever settles, and it seems to settle within 24 hours, all of those symptoms should disappear. So I don't think that it'll be a big problem. And we don't see this as potentially triggering a relapse and so forth, especially in people who are really well controlled on treatments. I think it's unlikely that it'll be more than an inconvenience. So there was, of course, with the vaccines, some cases reported of transverse myelitis. I think there were 2 cases reported. And that's basically where you have a little spot of inflammation in the spinal cord. So these are not unique to the COVID-19 vaccines. That is considered a rare side effect of other vaccines as well. And they were found with hepatitis B vaccinations when they first rolled out, and also with the Gardasil program, there was 1 or 2 cases. And in some cases, it's actually people who have MS, and this is just the way that it was unmasked. But there are 1 or 2 cases where it was isolated and people recovered. So, but we don't see that, as any evidence that there would be a risk of triggering a MS relapse.
Okay, thanks. That's very, very reassuring information. And do we know how the vaccinations are going to be given?
Well, they're all given intramuscularly. So you're given, it comes in 2 doses, probably in your arm. And the spacing of the Pfizer vaccine, I think you have a dose and then you have to wait at least 3 weeks before having the second dose. And the same with the Novavax one, the protein one, is also about a month apart. The AstraZeneca, the Oxford vaccine, that one is also given in 2 doses, but the second dose is given 3 months after the first dose. So there's a longer space. We've also seen, of course, that in the UK, for instance, they've decided to space the vaccines much further apart. So their goal is just to at least get 1 injection into everybody before they start worrying about when the second dose should be. So the second dose really does get you that extra little bit of immunity, but most of the immunity that you develop is with that very first one. So apart from perhaps with the AstraZeneca, the Oxford one, where it does look like people get better if they have that second dose. So a big boost in immunity. So yeah, and it's going to be interesting to see how the rollout actually works in reality. But we're so lucky in that we have such good health systems in place that, I think I wouldn't be surprised if Australia will meet its vaccination targets without too much trouble.
And what about some people have questions around how fast the vaccine's been approved in Australia, and what are the normal processes that can reassure people about that, and in this case in the vaccination as well too?
Sorry, Jodi, you broke up there. Did you ask about the approval process?
Yeah, and some people are a bit concerned about how fast they've been approved and what concerns there are about that. And you've spoken a little bit about how the vaccines are similar to other vaccines, but just some reassurances about the process in Australia that I guess it does give reassurance.
Yeah, so again, yeah, we're in a good position. So, you know, any new drug that has to be has to go through a certain approval process in Australia. So the first step is really for it to be approved by the Therapeutics Goods Administration, or the TGA. So the TGA's job, and they have a committee that would be assigned to the specific drug, which consists of pharmacists, scientists, and a whole number of people, and they would have a very careful look at all of the trial data. They have the opportunity to question that information and to ask for additional information from the pharmaceutical companies who's developed the drug. And that sort of process in general, you know, can often take up to a year sometimes. And that's often what we see when we hear about new MS drugs. It takes quite a while to get through that process. But in this case, because there's such an urgent need for these vaccinations, this has been prioritized, which means that they are basically dedicating much more resources to review this huge amount of information. And that's why it might feel fast to people, but the same meticulous processes are being followed. And it's always reassuring if it's also passed through safety reviews in other jurisdictions. So the fact that it's also passed through the same process of scrutiny with the FDA in the US, the European drugs and therapeutics committees as well. All of these committees, and they don't always agree. You know, we've certainly seen with some of our MS drugs that the Europeans would say, no way, we need another trial, and the FDA would approve. So it's not just an automatic stamp if one agency approves it. So all of these agencies are independent and they scrutinize it very carefully. And then usually after that, you know, once it's TGA approved, that basically means that if you can actually get your hands on it, you could buy it. But then often there's not a supply. But then the next step generally is for it to become available on Medicare and be fully funded, which means that it has to be approved by the PBS. So, and so there's another level of scrutiny there, but that's often much more political and financial decisions.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And do you think that it will be free in Australia, the vaccination?
I reckon. I think so.
I do too, but good to know. And for people with MS, will they? I know there's lots that we can't answer, but will their GPs be able to give the treatments, or will you be recommending that people get their vaccinations from their GP and that's okay, or do they need to come to the MS specialists to do that?
No, I think people should be able to have it, you know, wherever it's offered. So, you know, if your number is up and it's your turn, I would certainly say, you know, attend to the place where you're allocated to get your vaccine. Or if you do have a choice, you know, having it with a trusted healthcare provider like your GP would be a very sensible decision. Unless, you know, there's a specific reason where you've been advised to have it, say, in a hospital situation because you've had a very bad allergic reaction in the past or something like that. But other than that, you know, people should just follow whatever the healthcare advice is around the vaccine program.
Mm-hmm. And for people trying to manage around dosages of different treatments, then speaking to their neurologists, but also those guidelines will be able to help.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, obviously, you know, there's always places where you can get sort of specific advice to yourself. You know, everybody's situation is a little bit different. And like I said before, you know, once we know exactly when we'll be able to, when a person with MS could have their vaccine, and we know when the next dose of their medication is due or something like that, there could be some, you know, a little bit of flexibility around that. But in general, you know, yeah, so there's always people available to talk to. And if you're not certain about what to do, you know, really reach out to your MS clinic or your neurologist to figure it out together.
Yeah. Thanks, Anneke. Thank you. I mean, I know there's lots of people will have a lot more questions, and we know that. And I'm sure MS Australia and the other MS organisations in different states, we're working closely with MS clinics. We learned a lot about how to get information out to people really quickly through the pandemic, and this will be the same, and hopefully we can touch base, and we'll continue to touch base with you and MS clinics and Australian MS neurologists. We're all very grateful that the MS community is really working together, and thank you for your time today. Really appreciate it, and I'm sure that people will have lots of questions. So if you do have questions, please don't hesitate to get in touch with us through the MS Connect line, and we'll get back to you. So thanks again so much, Anneke. Very much appreciated.
No problem.
For more information on anything that we have covered today, please get in touch with MS Connect on free call 1800 042 138 or email msconnect@ms.org.au. And don't forget to find the MS podcasts on your favourite podcast player such as Apple, Google Play, Spotify, Overcast, or you can access the podcast directly from our website, ms.org.au.